Hello everybody and welcome to another IAPC&M CPD webinar. I'm Dawn Campbell, your host, and today I'm joined as usual by David Monroe-Jones, Acting Head of Accreditation. And in the hot seat today, we have the lovely Hilton Goodmans from South Africa. Welcome, Hilton.
Thank you so much, Dawn. It's a privilege.
It's lovely to hear your dulcet tones after all these times.
Thank you.
So today we're on number 8 in this series of 12, creating awareness through feedback and challenge. Now, as we know from anybody who's listened to these calls on a regular basis, everything is interlinked and it all stems from having a great coaching agreement established. But as usual, we start with David in terms of what is the definition of creating awareness through feedback and being able to challenge and giving that client the wider perspective that they need. David, please.
Okay, thank you, Dawn. So the definition as it appears within the model and, of course, on the assessment form itself, the heading of which is creating awareness through feedback and challenge. And the sub-definition for that is the ability to reflect a perspective beyond the words expressed by the client that enables the client to become aware of a wider perspective. And before we get into the real meat of this, so obviously we have the indicators and the contraindicators that we might look for. You're absolutely correct. It links, or everything links back to the coaching contract, because part of that is allowing the client to understand that part of the process will be feedback, part of it will be challenge. But also, thinking about the other sort of CPD calls that we've had, we're now starting to get into that transition. Whereas a lot of the other things have either been the contract, obviously, so like right up front in the coaching session. But now we're starting to get really into the meat of the coaching session itself. So, getting into, what's going on, the reality of situations, the options, the obstacles, and really getting to work with the client at a much deeper level, which is slightly different to what we've talked about so far, but really starts to connect those dots, so that if we've been actively listening, if we've been asking powerful questions, then the responses that have been coming back are giving us the information that allows us to create this awareness through feedback and challenge.
Thank you. And what about you, Hilton? What would be your definition? I mean, you're out there in the field, you're coaching corporately, and I know it's a very different culture for you. What would be your definition, please?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Dawn. I do think that it's about being present in the moment with the client and not forgetting the dual responsibility that we have to both listen and to reflect. I think it goes with the mirroring side that we've spoken about so much on these sessions as well. And if we're looking at the opportunity to work with the client and really understand their context, I think the key is to not take for granted where they're coming from, but to probe and to really understand rather than just assume. And certainly I think the awareness is sometimes, as we were saying earlier as well with the earlier sessions about self, understanding self as well, being aware of what we're thinking and pausing some of that in the moment to make sure that we're really grappling with their reality so that we can reflect back things that are relevant to them. I think those are very important aspects of this conversation.
I'm glad you mentioned reflecting back. And as you say, we've talked about mirroring and using the client's language and keeping it clean. That is a really important part of feedback, isn't it?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So David, what are some of the scenarios that you encounter when you are assessing applicants for IAPC&M accreditation? How would they, how would you monitor whether they're achieving this?
One of the ways really is to what degree the coach is prepared to dig, because if you follow, if we take a model such as T, Grow, or Oscar, or Clear, or I Can Achieve, or whichever of the models that are out there, once you get a client talking about the the current reality, there's almost an instinction of, right, I've covered the the R part of this, or I've covered the objectives, or I found out what's going on. I now need to move on to the options. But if you move on to the options and you haven't really explored the reality of what's going on, which might be slightly different to the way the client describes it, then the options that they're going to come up with are going to be almost superficial. So one of the things that I often discuss, like in feedback sessions, when we're talking about the feedback and challenge, if you excuse the the repeating of the word, is to ask that question. You're like, what is the core issue that the client is actually dealing with, and did you actually get to that in as part of the conversation? So what we're looking for is the ability for the coach to go beyond what the client says, and and get to that real issue, and not to be frightened to challenge the client about their views about either the situation themselves, or the way that they might go about dealing with it.
What would be some examples that you could share?
An example might be, if we take somebody who is working on wanting to become more organized. Yeah, and they make a reference and say that I need to be more organized because I'm finding that I'm starting to forget things, and part of that process misses the question about, right, well, what do you mean by organized? So there's that exploration of understanding what the client's dealing with. And one of the things that tends to be missed, not always, but quite often, is the what's working, what's not working, and what's getting in the way. More so the what's getting in the way piece. So if a client turns around and says something along the lines of, I'm using a to-do list, but I'm not finding it really effective, and that's not challenged and feedback doesn't come back to it, what you get is something along the lines of, okay, so how could you, for example, how could you make that to-do list more effective? It doesn't address the issue of why the person's not using it. And it's easy to get swayed, especially if you're very knowledgeable or you've been through a similar situation, and you lean on, right, well, at the back of your mind is, well, this is what I would do. So how can we improve it? If it's not addressed and it's not challenged of okay, I understand what you're saying. What is it about the to-do list that's not working for you at the moment? Well, I'm not really motivated in that. Right. Well, that's a different, that's something else. So what you've started to do through the questioning and the challenging feeding back is starting to uncover different things that are going on. And the way that I described it in a recent feedback session, and I have to say, I did lift this analogy from the film The Call, is it's a little bit like a peach. So on the outside, you've got the furry skin, if that's an accurate description of a peach. And then when you take the that off, you've got the meat. And then inside that, right at the core, you've got that hard seed, the shell bit. And that's what you want to get to, because everything else beyond that is really just presentation and projection. And the feedback and challenge is very much about digging into those bits, which allows you to focus on the real issue and not focus on something that is maybe trivial and is not indicative of a larger issue or a larger client agenda.
Thank you. I mean, perhaps one of the things that we ought to discuss, well, two things that spring to mind listening to you, David, is one is that giving feedback is a particular skill set, which hopefully most coaches have learned. There are rules of giving feedback, and perhaps we can come to that in a moment. But there's also, again, it goes back to the contract, getting permission to challenge your client. So how do you deal with that, Hilton, when you've got a new client? How do you address that, please?
Sure. Good question, Dawn. I think it's so important in the contracting that you establish the boundaries, that they are boundaries that are understood for the sessions, that people understand that you're not attacking them, that this isn't personal, but you're going to be working with the situation, and getting permission to reflect back to them things like, if I notice something in our session that would be helpful to you as feedback, may I comment on that? May I actually share that with you if in the moment, for example, you reflect the very behavior that you're saying you don't do? May I point it out to you and make you aware of it, because you may not be aware that you're doing it. And often folks will say, sure, yeah. And then when you do it, of course, it's a bit jarring. But if you've got the permission up front, it's so easy to then carry on and to really get value out of the conversation.
Yeah, good one. I like that. It's slightly different to the way that I do it. I basically just say to my client, I can be gently challenging, or I can give you a kick up the butt, which is going to get you closer to your goal. And of course, you phrase that slightly differently depending on who you're talking to, but that's the essence of it.
Very good.
And then, of course, during the sessions, I think, well, you did give me permission to challenge you, or or whatever. But once you've got that permission, you've got to make sure you actually follow through, haven't you, David? We can't hear you.
So apologies, so I was muted there twice. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is a sort of a number of different things that sort of come out of some of the work from Marshall Goldsmith, and what he talks about is it's predominantly aimed towards sort of like leadership and sort of like executive coaching, but the principle I think sort of like is transferable, is that there are really sort of like three elements, and what he talks about is courage, humility, and discipline. And the courage part is that recognition that you know what, you're like, there are things that I need to talk about that take me out of the comfort zone. So I think so, like from one of the previous webinars, there was the reference, and I've made a reference to this before, about, if you get a client just to talk about stuff that they already know, it's not as powerful as getting them to talk about things and recognize things, as Hilton says, that they don't know, or they don't recognize. So the courage part's getting out of the comfort zone. And the humility part of that is accepting that, you know what, you're like, some of the feedback that I might get, some of the challenge might not be what I really want to hear. It's that recognition that, oh, well, although I didn't think I was perfect, I didn't realize I was that bad either. And things like that are important. And getting this at the contracting stage, along with the discipline part, and the discipline is really for the client to follow this through, so that, as different things come up, as this Hilton was saying, so if you receive some feedback of, right, I didn't realize I was doing something that I said I wasn't doing or didn't want to do, that they do something with that, and that they can continue through it, and they don't just, if you excuse the expression, so like throw their toys out of the pram and go, look, like, I'm not interested in this. All I want is an easy life. And I think that reference that you make, Dawn, excuse me, is really important about the, what is that level of challenge that you want? Because, we can go through a coaching session and make you like comfortable and easy, or, I can, as you describe it, you're like, we can do the kick butt bit, and really get you to do the things that you want. And I think so, like within that, the feedback and the challenge means that if you start to do that and they go, well, I'm not really too sure about this, you can go back to the contract and say, well, look, when we contracted, this is what you said you wanted. If you're now saying it's not, then we need to recontract. But in reality, this is probably going to work better. What do you want to do?
And Hilton, what examples have you got that you would like to share of, perhaps when you've given neat feedback and it's bombed, or it's been really well received and because you've learned from previous experiences? Can you think of anything funny to share with us?
Sure. It's a good one. Yeah, I mean, I think about somebody that I was coaching from a hotel environment, from the hospitality industry. And as a general manager of a hotel, he was really undermining his own trust with his organization based on his behavior. He wasn't aware that, for example, when he spoke to somebody and said, this other person really isn't doing so well, that would feed back to the person who was not doing so well. And so he was undermining himself by basically gossiping behind his staff's back. It really wasn't wise. And I was trying to figure out through our first conversation, what kind of person is he? Is this important to him? Is it of value to him? Or is he generally just so direct that he's going to tell you all the time and you take the good with the bad, etc.? And it was fascinating to chat to him. And while this may not be funny, it was pretty scary sitting with him and saying, are you aware that you might be working against yourself and actually eroding your own trust? And he said, how? Tell me more. Tell me how? And it was a case of saying to him, talk to me about your relationship with your staff and how do you communicate negative things to them? And he would say, well, I just do this, etc. And he avoided the fact that he actually spoke behind their backs. And so I needed to say, well, actually, I have another view. Some of your team told me that they are not sure if they can trust you because of this. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we had to really confront it face to face. I mean, I think the advantage was that we were able to confront it. He was able to get a real handle on it, to know how to change. And he was quite shocked. His behavior thereafter reflected that it genuinely was a surprise to him that this was an issue. And he turned around and was able to adjust his behavior to the point where his staff said, oh, we can see the growth. We can see you've stopped this negative speech and you've actually become more positive in how you frame things. You're actually not running us down in front of each other or to each other anymore. So certainly I think the biggest surprise there was his response, that he was blissfully unaware that this was an issue for him.
But once pointed out, he was big enough to grow from it. So that's 360-degree feedback, getting it from several parties as opposed to just your coach. He had the evidence and he learned from that. So that's a great example. And interestingly, there is a saying, isn't there, that feedback says more about the person giving it than receiving it. Now, I don't know if that's just a defense mechanism, but let's just throw it out there. I mean, what do you think, Hilton?
Feedback as a defense mechanism.
Yes, because they say, oh, well, feedback says more about you than it does me.
Yeah, I think there's truth in the fact that we often are saying more about ourselves than about the person we're speaking to, and that our biases are represented in what we're saying. But I do think that defensiveness is such a challenging thing, especially with executives. I find that the C-suite is more defensive than many places because people have a lack of a growth mindset in many ways, where they're concerned about looking good versus being good. And if we could just get past the idea that you've got to look good, you've got to have everything together, that you need to show that you are the man of the hour or the woman of the hour and that you deserve to be there, and rather just be authentic. I think that is a starting point, is a wonderful discussion in your first session, to just talk about mirroring in the sense of being a mirror to them and saying, I really want you to be authentic in this discussion, because ultimately that is the difference. You don't need to defend yourself to me. I assume the best of you. And I think that the assumption of good, almost going back to theory X, theory Y from McGregor, way back in the 50s or 60s, and saying, well, what's our view of people? Is our worldview of people that they're basically wanting to support us? If so, well, then we'll probably assume the best of them and give them a chance, versus saying, no, they're against me. Unless I control them and this discussion and this feedback, I'm not really being a leader. So I think there are quite a few things to challenge there in the defensiveness. And I guess the resilience side, if we're building the confidence of the person, they will be able to, almost from the inside, be so strong that what's coming at them from the outside won't be a challenge to them. They'll still have a confident sense of self-esteem and purpose and knowing who they are, that it won't be taken as offensive when something that is negative feedback comes to them.
Yeah, you've made a very good point there, Hilton. That's why you're on the call. You know, people who have a good self-esteem, who are confident, who are relaxed, perhaps you could go as far as to say who can laugh at themselves, you know, don't take things like so seriously, believe they're not perfect. You know, they're able to take feedback on the chin, aren't they? And work through it. What would you add to that, David?
I don't know whether I would add that much to it, to be honest. I think sort of like Hilton's covered it really well. I think that empirical evidence sort of like tells us that different personality styles will like respond to feedback sort of like in different ways. And as an example of that, just using two extremes, if you said to somebody, thank you very much for the report, the majority of it was really, really good. There's just about 3 or 4 like little tweaks that I'd like you to make before we take it as the final submission. There are some personality types who will take that as, yeah, okay, like no problem, I'll make those changes and I'll get on with it. I really appreciate the feedback. Thank you very much. There are others who will take that as a personal affront to them, as an individual, and it will be, oh yeah, I'm not good enough. I haven't achieved so like the level that I want, because they have a be perfect driver, or they have sort of like a number of other things that are going on. Because one of the things that's interesting, especially sort of like within leadership and management training, is that a lot of time is spent with the, this is how you deliver feedback, but there is very little training or development around, let's talk about how to receive feedback and how to receive it in sort of like a neutral perspective. Because feedback is just feedback. It's neither, it's neither positive nor negative. It's just feedback. It's what you do with it that makes that difference. I think the only other thing that I would add to that is, because I think the expression is, feedback is the breakfast of champions, and part of that is, looking at it and remembering that you can make a decision as to what you can do with it. And you're either going to do something with it or you're not. And one of the other things that often comes up, certainly in the assessment process, which we'll come on to in the later sort of modules, so once we get into looking at actions, is that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So you can provide as much feedback and challenge as you want, but it's up to the client then, what they're going to do with it, if anything.
And of course, that's why people come to coaching. There's only so much they can do with their best friend, their partner, or whatever, but they're not necessarily skilled at giving feedback, and they're not necessarily going to have the courage or the discipline to push when it comes to challenge. So that's one of the reasons why coaching works. So in terms of giving feedback, what are some of the rules that you would say somebody who's going to be a good coach giving feedback needs to observe, please, David?
The first and foremost one is recognizing the difference between objective and subjective feedback. And I'll give an example of that. If you imagine that you're observing like a group of people in a meeting, and you notice that like the 2 people that you're working with, from a coach perspective, during the meeting, they're looking down, they're sort of scribbling on bits of paper, they don't seem interested, they're rocking backwards and forwards on the chairs, or they're looking out of the window, or, or things of that nature. Subjective feedback would be talking to them afterwards and saying, look, I noticed that you were looking at bits of paper and you were looking out of the window, you seemed completely disinterested, you weren't really paying attention, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why was that? That's subjective because you're essentially sort of imposing what you believe was going on for them in that situation. Objective feedback would be describing the behavior that you see. So I noticed that you were scribbling on notes and you were looking out of the window, and then asking that question, what was going on for you, and literally just leaving it open like that. The key to this is that we can all look at something, and if somebody says, look, what's your opinion about what's going on there, we'll all have one. We'll all have a perspective, but objectivity is very much about describe what you see and then ask what's going on, because that will give you then the client's view and the client's opinion about what's happening. Beyond that, once you start to get into effective feedback, there is, and I don't know whether it's still available on the internet, but there was something that was completed some while ago called the feedback report, which I've got a printed copy of somewhere, and it was reams and reams of information about what was the best feedback. But the key things that come out of it is that other than the objectivity of it, is that it's given to the person as soon as possible, so it's not held back for, oh, by the way, 4.5 hours ago you did this. So it's in the moment, as close to whatever it is you need to feedback as possible. It's direct, concise and understandable, so it's not flowered up, so the person who's delivering the feedback doesn't get nervous about saying, look, this is what it is, talk to me about it. And the other thing as well is to recognize that it's not coming preloaded. Feedback is just feedback, and that if we get into this habit, and it's not helped by some training, in my humble opinion, when we talk about, things like the praise burger that used to always get in appraisals and performance reviews of, give them some good feedback and then some negative feedback and then some good feedback, because it gives you that connotation of, right, what I'm going to describe now is is good, bad, or indifferent, and that mindset of, right, this is what I'm observing, or as Hilton was saying about the 360 degree or 180 degree feedback, this is what I've observed, this is what other people are observing. It just becomes feedback, and then you can have that discussion about it. Listening to the response, both what's said and what's not said, are really critical skills. Watching for emotional changes, because going back to the the courage and the humility aspect, you might give somebody some feedback, and it may glance off them, or it may really hit home. And sometimes some feedback it is felt at a really, really deep and emotional level, and that's something else to think about, because feedback with a big F covers everything that we might talk about. But sometimes the feedback that we're talking about is behavioral, so we can see it. Sometimes it's more emotional, or it's values based, or it's motivational based, which means it's much more of an internal aspect. So it's possible that it's going to have a bigger impact once you start talking to the person about it. And the other thing is not to overload somebody with feedback. You can only really deal with about between 3 and 5 pieces of feedback, so at any one moment in time. And also, if you're going to be working on something, then you really want to be perhaps identifying what the feedback is, and then highlighting the one that's most important, and working your way through that one before you start dealing with some of the others. Because if you provide people with a sort of a smorgasbord of feedback good, bad, or indifferent, it's likely that the client will fixate on the one that they want to talk about, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the one that's most important, and it doesn't mean that that's the one that's going to be the one that helps them to move on. It might just be the one that either A, takes their interest, or B, they strongly disagree with, or C, is sort of easier to accept, rather than, you know, like perhaps some of the more challenging things that they may have been presented with.
And of course, if they've got a perfectionist personality, they're only going to hear the one negative thing out of everything that you've said.
Oh yeah, there are two sides to the be perfect driver, and these are sort of in the moment things. But one of them is I must be perfect for you, and the other one is I must be perfect for me. Either of which sort of will cause a few sort of like ruffled feathers during the feedback stage, especially the more challenging it is, then so like the more likelihood is that so like some things might need some time so like to sink in.
That sounds like a great report, and perhaps we can have it for the blog when we upload this recording, David. So there's a challenge for you to dig into those archives.
Yeah, and not wanting to self-promote something that's coming, but when we have Nate talking about his new book, so like, and the process communication model, it's likely, so like, because I'm hosting that, it's likely that, so like, I'll be asking them about those aspects of different drivers and how they may materialize, so like in different coaching sessions.
Right.
So there'll be something in there for everyone as well.
Yeah. And for those of you listening, that's the 10th of November. So watch this space.
It is.
Hilton, what would you like to add to what David's been saying, please? I know I could see you nodding and giving a thumbs up. So obviously resonated with you, and you've got lots to add.
I don't have much to do other than to embellish. I think it was such a lovely, comprehensive view. I made a couple of notes myself and just thought, wow, that's great. I think the one thing I would add is just literally that the environment also needs to be conducive to feedback. As in, if you're going to confront somebody on the factory floor as they've got headphones on and say, you know what, I was really wanting to tell you something. The timing is wrong. And as concise, clear, whatever your communication is, the context is not conducive to learning. And I think sometimes even in our face-to-face sessions, the circumstances that the person is going through, for example, they have just got a phone call 5 minutes before your session that has now derailed their train of thought. I think their personal circumstances and context just have an impact on the session, and we need to be aware of it, and possibly also the actual physical environment and how we set that up to make sure that we can get the kind of learning and the kind of conversations moving ahead that we want to. That's all that I would add.
Okay, thank you. And David, when we talk about creating awareness through feedback and challenge, how would you differentiate feedback and then challenging in terms of the assessment process?
The key difference between the two is with the feedback is very akin to like almost paraphrasing or or summarizing. So you can start that by saying, okay, so what I'm hearing is, or what you're telling me is, or what it appears to be is this. With feedback, you can also ask a question and say, for example, I have some experience in this area. Would I be, would it be permissible to provide you with some feedback, from an observational point of view? In which case, it's giving the opportunity then of providing something from the coach's perspective. Once you get to the challenge stage, the challenge is almost getting into going back to the time management, our organization as an example. And somebody says, I'm doing the to-do list and I'm just not organized, and they start to talk about the to-do list. The challenge part is saying, okay, I understand and I hear you talking about the, so like the to-do list. However, it doesn't appear to me that that is the real issue. So, if you think about, what is the real issue that you're dealing with here? And it's challenging them to think a little bit deeper, to look a little bit wider. And equally, if somebody turns around and they answer a question, but they provide an answer that is an answer, but it's just not an answer to the question because they naturally sort of like diverted off for whatever reason, you can go back on that and say, thank you very much, that was a really nice answer. However, it wasn't the answer to the question that I asked. And you can either ask the question, or if they come back with a response, you can actually say, okay, the challenge that I have with your response is it's not congruent with other things that have gone on in the coaching session. And this is where it's important to recognize that it's not about just working your way through the coaching session and ticking things off and thinking, right, I've done the introduction, I've done the objectives bit, I've done, I'm now moving into the reality. It's remembering that you need to remember, excuse me, using the word twice, what's gone on before. So whether you're taking notes or whether you tend to keep the information in your head, it's going back and thinking, that's not what you said earlier on. What you said earlier on was something different. And the challenge part of it is really sort of getting them to think in that wider context. So you might ask a question such as, okay, so pausing there, if a friend came to you, so like with exactly the same issue, how would you challenge them on it? What would you ask them to really get to the core of it? What would you think the issue was that they were dealing with? Not the one they're presenting with, what is the actual issue? And questions like that just help people to open up a little bit. It can take time because it depends what the issue is. Behavioral things tend to be quite simple. They tend to just come up around I should be doing this, but I'm doing that instead. So using another recent example within a coaching session, the assessment topic was developing a lesson plan in terms of reading, and the core issue was just a lack of motivation, and underneath that was a lack of certainty about what was happening. However, it's very easy to focus on all right, well, let's put a plan together. It doesn't dig into it. So the types of questions that I would be looking for in a similar sort of context would be, okay, so, you're not doing that, what's the reason behind you not doing it? What's preventing you from doing that? What's underneath what you're telling me? What are you not telling me that you feel? And depending upon the relationship that you've got, because a lot of these questions that are quite deep are challenging for the coach to ask somebody that they've just met for the first time. But to really get into that, okay, so so what's going on for you? Never mind the waffle, just getting to the core of it. What's really going on? And just separating the wood from the chaff, or the chaff from the something or other. Yeah. I must remember not to use quotes that I don't really know what they are. But to just to get in and challenge the person. And the thing is, it's to remember that you're challenging, not interrogating. You're challenging, not criticizing. You're just pushing that question in there, to get as deep as you can to get the information out.
I think I can safely say, as somebody who's just gone wheat free, it's wheat from the chaff.
Right, thank you. I knew there was a W in there somewhere.
Yeah. So interestingly, what you're saying, David, is actually that a coach has to have a certain degree of self-awareness in order to have the courage that now is the time to challenge and step up and challenge because they're being paid to coach. So there's two sides of it, isn't there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And a coach needs to, certainly sort of once we get into the sort of your like senior master fellow level, coaches also need to be able to deal with your like uncertainty, complexity, your like ambiguity, and you're like all sorts of things that might manifest themselves. And the courage, the humility, and the discipline is just as important, for the coach as it is for the client, because as I've said to a lot of people, because so within the feedback, one of the things that often comes up is, okay, well, can you provide a list of challenging questions and powerful questions? And as I've said to a lot of people, so like, we can, but what you have to think about is context. So a powerful question is in the right moment. So any question can be challenging if it's pointed at the right thing. It's a bit like archery, and so like you're like in hitting the center, and that's what you're looking to do. So if you can't draw a link between the client situation and the various different aspects of that, and challenge them to focus on the thing that's most important, which might be, if you think about your sort of like your options, and so that's, I think, so like the next CPD call. But when you think about options, you can challenge at that point by asking the client when they've come out, well, you're like, these are the options, and this is the one that I'm going to do first because that's the one I want to do. A challenge is simply, okay, how is that going to get you to achieve what it is that you said you wanted right at the outset? Okay, how effective is that going to be? How easy is it going to be? What skills do you have to be able to do that? What experience do you have that will enable you to do that? And putting those sort of challenges in there allows the client to, as you say, so like to be open, but it also forces the coach to really draw on their internal skill set and recognize that your purpose is to help the client get from wherever they are to wherever they need to get to or want to get to. It's about being friendly. It's not about being their friend. And that's sort of like is an important consideration, because there is a danger, certainly once you get to this level, so once you get to the awareness and sort of feedback and challenge, if you just stick with the standard coaching model, whichever one that's sort of like that you're familiar with, whichever one you want to work with, it can become a little bit sort of like ticky box. And that question that you should always keep in your mind, in my opinion, is, have I got to the real issue? Because by the time you get to the awareness and feedback stage, and so like feedback and challenge, if you haven't got to that, then a chunk, the half, maybe more of the coaching session might have gone. And if you're still talking about superficial things, you haven't really got much time then to really nail down the action points and the other things that are going to make a difference.
And it's the challenge that brings the aha moments, as we know, isn't it, Hilton?
Sure, definitely, absolutely. I think without the challenge, we're offering a service, but it's perhaps not a business case. And where folks are being coached from a business case, or even in the life coaching space, where we're really trying to help people to achieve more of their own personal potential, and we really want to see change and growth. And without the challenge, it isn't there. And I'm very taken by what you were saying about self-awareness as well. And I just made a note that we're always missing pieces. We always see in part, not in full. Just a bit like looking at our noses. It's always there. It's out of focus, the nose. But if we focus on that, we're going to miss other things. And if we're looking out, we're almost always missing our nose. Thankfully, in the case of a German nose like mine. And with these sort of opportunities to coach the person as well, I think if we're aware as coaches of the fact that we're never seeing the full picture. There's always more. There's an extra layer, as you mentioned with the peach, David. There's always more, and if we're not getting to the heart, and I made that mistake myself, even as an experienced coach, I would sometimes be played by the political environment because, as you mentioned, perhaps I'm too agreeable. I was too friendly rather than being objective and saying, hang on, what's the big picture here? Let's get some more evidence. Let's be more empirical in the approach and ask better questions until we really know what's going on. And I think the tendency to quickly snap onto, that's the problem, is often encouraged in the lighter model approach. If we're just going to use the model and apply it in 30 minutes, T-Grow or whatever it is, we're just going to go through it and there you go, we've answered all the questions. Thank you so much. You are the weakest link. Take the walk of shame. And I think we have the opportunity to really dig deep and make sure that, as you say, we're getting to the pip in the middle with the real seeds that can either grow great fruit or destruction in the person's life and their relationships. And we want to prevent that by really being aware ourselves and then also making sure that we get to the heart of it, which is great. Thank you, Dawn.
Yeah, I mean, you've just sort of touched on really the focus of Marianne Franklin's book. She did a webinar for us in May for International Coaching Week. Her book is Laser Focused Coaching. And of course, having the self-awareness takes confidence and practice to be able to do that very, very quickly. But it is important that you grow courage rather than just sticking to your 50 best coaching questions that are in your training manual. You have to use your intuition and address self-sabotage, not just because this is something that I hear a lot with newbie coaches, is that they're quite comfortable with dealing with self-sabotage in terms of bringing it out, but then they don't know what to do with it. And they've got to have the confidence to challenge. Otherwise, it's just left hanging for the next session and the next session. So what would be some of the questions that we would ask in scenarios that perhaps some of the people who are listening to this call, because they aspire to becoming better coaches, that they could take away from today's call? Hilton, perhaps a question from you as a sort of top tip in terms of a challenging question they can use.
That's good. Working on the challenge side, I think a lot of it is so context-based that I'm actually struggling a little bit to put it into one for myself, to be honest. I guess what's at the heart of this? What does this really mean to you? And why is this important to you? It comes back to what's going on in the person. So if something needs to be reflected, if I'm going to challenge something along the lines of, I'm noticing this, is this a pattern? And if I go to systems theory, if there's a pattern, it's often related to a root cause. And so I'm often interested in the pattern. So is this a pattern for you? Might be a question I'm asking. Or how does this relate to the rest of your experience? Is there more than one event that this has happened in? So I would be wanting to look for a pattern. And forgive me, I'm not sure which question I'd ask per se, but it's really seeking the pattern of, is there more than one issue here? Is it something that really has a root cause? Or is it merely an event, a once-off, where it was just a circumstance, somebody slapped them as they walked past, it's no surprise that they got a little bit angry. But if the anger is there because there's some deep-seated issues, as there would be in a coaching conversation, I'd be looking for the pattern.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've kind of summed it up. If I think of Marian's question, her one question throughout the Laser Focused book is, what does this mean to you? Drilling down on that is kind of similar to your why question. What would be a question that you would ask then, David, please, or questions?
I think, I mean, so I really liked the questions that Hilton was discussing. Just as an aside, so like there is a book called Challenging Coaching, and they make a reference in that to, I think it's called Zuda or something, but it is what they describe as the zone of uncomfortable debate. And one of the questions that I would use or have used, I wouldn't necessarily say that I would use the same question all the time because it depends, is once somebody's talked about something that they're doing, is to ask them, how is that serving you? How is that benefiting you? And what I'm looking for in that is whether it is, because if it's not, my follow-up question, and as I've mentioned before, I do ask why, and I do let clients know at the contracting stage that I do this. But I would be tempted to say, like, how is that serving you? Is it beneficial? Like, if it's not, why are you still doing it? Like, what is it about that's driving you forward? You're like, what's preventing you? Why haven't you done anything about it? And things like that. So, like, for me, so I challenge them to get into the core of things. I have and again, so like it's in my contract, but because of my style of coaching, I stress my style of coaching, there are times when I want people to justify why they've done something so that we can work with it, because people live in a wider world, so the people are used to being asked why in a variety of contexts. And so from coaching, the challenge for me is not so much what are they going to go in and do, because I think if you've done all of these bits so far, accepting that we're going to be talking about options and actions as we go forward in the final series of CPD calls. But if we've done everything correct up to and including this point, the awareness of feedback and challenge, the options and the action points should be relatively straightforward. I think there's still, in the option stage, there's still a lot of feedback and challenge bit. But by that stage, we should be in a position to be really saying, right, okay, so based on what we've talked about, what are you going to do? Okay, so if you're going to do that, how is that going to serve you to achieve what you said you were going to achieve? And within that, if it's not, your counter challenge is, okay, so if I can provide you with a bit of feedback, the option that you've chosen does not appear to achieve as much as you want to. And you can either leave it there and let them answer it, or you can stick an additional sub question on the end around what are your views about that? What is it about this one that you've chosen that's different to the others? Because it may be that a client has found something that through the conversation, they've been challenged, they've got the feedback, they recognize something, they know what they should do, and I'm emphasizing the word should, but they don't want to choose it because that's the one that's difficult. That's the one that's going to be, more challenging. That's the one that's going to be harder to do. So they might pick something easier. So from a coach's point of view, it's making sure that the client is picking things that they should do through the challenge and reverting back to the feedback. There is I think it's Russ Harris, who was on YouTube. It comes from a mindfulness and acceptance and commitment therapy background. And in one of his, I think it was on YouTube, but I might be mistaken. So if people can't find it, apologies. But he was demonstrating more of a therapeutic session rather than anything else. And just paraphrasing and cutting through it all. The person was describing what they were doing, and his question back to them was very similar to Marion's with the laser focused coaching is, and how well is that working for you? Well, it's not working that well. Okay, so in that case, what is it that's driving you to continue to do something that's clearly not working? And it's those last words that's clearly not working that is the challenge that goes to the root of it. because it's not the what they're doing that matters, it's the why are they continuing to do something that isn't working.
Yeah, and it reminds me of Tony Robbins saying that we shouldn't, we've got to stop shoulding on ourselves. You know, and a coach, it needs to step up and challenge those words like, I must do this, I should do this. Well, who says you have to? And that's about finding out, you know, then where their motivation is coming from. And earlier you said, David, about doing something or not, as the case may be. And for me, from a challenging point of view, as a coach, I would then be playing devil's advocate. So you're absolutely right. You know, you do it or not, as the case may be. So playing devil's advocate. So what are the benefits of doing nothing and staying exactly where you are? That's quite challenging, and it helps get them to a deeper level and hopefully have an aha moment. And sometimes puts things back into perspective. If I take an example, I had a career client who said, oh, you know, I should take this promotion because it pays more, etc., etc. And actually, when we went through the devil's advocate scenario questions, he worked out he didn't want to stop being one of the boys and finishing at 5 o'clock and wearing a suit and, you know, whatever. And really, the promotion wasn't the right path for him at that particular time. So as coaches, we need to step up and do the job that we're being paid for and challenge our clients. I'm just conscious of the fact that we are coming towards the end of our time. And this hour that we have once a month to discuss all these wonderful topics that are so closely interlinked. What would you like to add, Hilton?
I was just saying how quickly time flies.
Yeah.
It just moves. Yeah, I think it's fascinating to talk about completing the role as well. I think a lot of our folks that we're working with are scared to go the whole hog and do the things that they don't want to do but are necessary for their role. And particularly I think about executives who are moving up or folks who are taking the next career step, the transition often requires becoming more strategic. And there's a lot that you leave behind. And so to your point, Dawn, about what we should do or what we could leave behind, and is there value in actually staying where we are? And if I think of Drotter and his leadership pipeline and all these other frameworks, sometimes the right thing is to say no. But we feel that the money and the career path is ahead, and so we should say yes. And if we look at our role and what we enjoy about it, we might conclude the aspects of the role I simply don't want to complete and don't want to do. And I'm going to pay someone else. I'm going to outsource that to someone else or find someone else who'll take that on, which I guess leads to the delegation and investing in others, being good soil for our team members as well, so that they can lift the load in areas where we are not so strong. And I'm reminded that links to humility as well, where we need to know what we're good at and what we're not as individuals. And as a coach, obviously, we're trying to build that and bring that out in folks so that they understand that it's a choice rather than a have to. It must be a want to. And I was just fascinated by how these come beautifully together with the business frameworks as well, like Clay Christensen, I think it is, who talks a lot about customer centricity. And he talks about how the push and pull factors on one side for someone to buy what you're doing or to take on a challenge need to be balanced against the inertia that they're feeling and the anxiety that they're feeling, because those are often standing in their way of making the decision. And we need to acknowledge and surface those, bring them out. Why should you move? Do you need to, etc.? So I've loved this discussion, and these points are very real, particularly in a business context.
Thank you. David, what, if anything, would you like to add before we start wrapping up, please?
I'm simply minded from Yoda, who said, there is no try, there is do or do not. And that links back to your question of what's what's the benefit or what's the impact of doing nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the only thing that I would add is that you have to have the courage of your convictions. Go with the flow. If something needs challenging, then challenging it. If there's an aspect of feedback, feedback to it. As Hilton was saying earlier, don't continually focus on the problem, especially if you've either A, got knowledge of it, or B, you've been through something similar, because you tend to, confirmation bias tends to lead us towards, I'll confirm, that, the way that you're going to deal with it is the way that I dealt with it, just through a natural process. And I think the key thing with that is, recognize that as a coach, your responsibility is work with the client, get to the core issue, help them to resolve the core issue, move on. And that's it. And if you're using assessments, if you're using profiling tools, then make sure that that you really know how to use them, because within that there is always a feedback session, and it's generally labeled feedback session. And the one piece of advice that I would offer is, especially when you're working with things like that and you're using feedback from other people, is if a client turns around and goes, yes, that's me, and they just leave it like that, because the likelihood is that there's more to that, because that might be them and that might be the way they see themselves. But as you were both saying about the raising the self-awareness, that yes, that might be how you see yourself, but that might not necessarily be the way that you want to be seen by other people and by the organization. So therefore, something might change, and there are all sorts of other connotations that go with that. And I think
that might not be how they are seen. Sorry, David, and it might not be reality either, and it might be an old perception.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And if anybody wants to have a look at something around perceptions, that's quite an interesting read. The Rashomon Effect, which is based on a Chinese or a Japanese play, I forget which is about, in a nutshell, is the investigation of a murder, and the person who's investigating speaks to 4 or 5 people who've observed this from different perspectives, different vantage points, and they all have a different view. So they all describe the same situation in completely different ways, and that's that's an important thing to think about. And it's also a good question as well, which is, okay, that's one perspective. How might other people see it? The Edward de Bono, one of his books, talks about using an exercise called Other People's Views. So how might somebody else see it? How might this person see it? How else could it be seen? If it was viewed from above, from the left, from the right, from below, how would that change? And it's all that, that movement, and getting to a point. And I think the key thing is to, and I've just thought about this while I'm talking, the key thing as well is to recognize when you've gone far enough, when you've provided enough feedback, when you've provided enough challenge, to then say, right, okay, we've done enough. Now it's time to move on to, perhaps looking at options and helping the person to identify how they're going to move forward.
And yet still remembering when we've got that feedback from our client, to perhaps help them realize that in certain situations that could be good or negative depending on the scenario. So it doesn't have to be a negative thing. That's worth remembering.
This I mean, we could almost have a separate conversation about that in itself.
You mentioned I think it was a book or a quote, and it had try in it when you just started talking a moment ago, David. What was it?
When it had what in it, sorry?
Try.
That was Yoda.
What was the quote?
there is no try, there is just do or do not.
Okay. So that reminds me of a little technique somebody once showed me. If a client says, oh, I'm really trying. You say, okay, throw your pen on the floor. You get the client to throw their pen on the floor, say, now try and pick it up. You either can pick it up or you can't. So that would be an example of challenging your client to stop using that kind of language that is reaffirming the fact that, you know, perhaps they can't or don't want to do something. Do they want to do it or don't they? Can they do it or can't they? There's no such thing as try. That's a funny little thing that I'll just throw in there. So as we wrap up then, coaches usually are perpetual students. And certainly when they go for the IAPC&M accreditation status, we know by definition, they're stepping up, they're challenging themselves, they're going over and above and beyond their coach training, so being properly trained and insured. So we know that we're working with like-minded people who want to challenge themselves. And I do remember, Hilton, probably one of the first times you and I had a conversation is years ago, you won a competition to be coached by a master coach. And Nikki was lucky enough to work with you, and you just loved that feedback and you grew so much from it. So that was a great example of, you know, you were already an experienced coach, weren't you? But you still got a lot out of it.
I was indeed. And I would like to say that I was very humble and open, but the truth is that I was challenged. I was really challenged by how good Nikki was. And she challenged me as to my own coaching strength. I realized I had so much to learn. I thought I was becoming a bit complacent. And by working with a mentor coach and refining, going back to the classroom, so to speak, and just being refined by the process of accreditation, it was a wonderful journey that challenged me to say, you know what, you're mixing mentoring and coaching. And when you're with a client, that's very unhelpful because you don't need to convey certain stuff. You need to bring it out of them. You need to facilitate learning in them, not impose anything. And be an adult to adult rather than a parent to a child, if I use transactional analysis language. And Nikki was incredibly good at just bringing me out and challenging me with phrases that just made me think, wow, I've got so much to learn. And I still feel that way. I love interacting with coaches and hearing how David phrases things, and yourself and the other folks. It's such a wonderful journey because we never arrive. We only get further along on the road, I think.
No, I think you're a great example of that, because in the subsequent years when I've dealt with you, I can still hear your development by the way that you think and write to me. So it's been a pleasure, you know, being part of that. And I'm glad it's still a positive set of feedback and experience in your mind.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
We don't normally take questions on this call because we run out of time, but let me just see if there are any questions. Oh, there's lots of thank yous. Thank you for everybody. Found this very helpful. Yeah, so great. Thank you very much. And of course, feedback is the life, it might be the breakfast of champions, but it's the lifeblood of any company. So anybody who would like to look at the feedback reviews that we have from our members at the IAPC&M, just log on to the blog. They will all tell you, it doesn't matter who they're members of, whether it's just us or us and another accreditation body, we are the most caring, sharing, available, supportive, hands-on, practical support that you can get. Thank you, Hilton, for the thumbs up. If you've any questions, please send them to us by email or the contact form on the blog. And we'll see you in a month's time where we'll be discussing considering options. And that's where we will really start to challenge and dig deep and explore self-sabotage in more detail. And then we'll be joined by the lovely Ruby. But for now, thank you very much for your interest and support, Hilton. And thank you as usual, David. And
thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Hilton.
What a pleasure. Thank you, folks.
You're welcome. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye now.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Stay safe, everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you.